back to work. What I'm doing here is just actually pressing record. So I'm going to start that over. But so we've been working with AIA Maine and BSLA and our colleagues at Red Thread and Workplace Transformation, listening and learning from our community about their experience and expectations for returning to shared spaces and places. And we continue to delve deeper into how we can rebuild our places and spaces to be safe, healthy, and equitable.
I can look, but you have your own computer, so I'm trying to.
I'm going to ask that everybody mute themselves. And so we are doing this in a Zoom format, a traditional Zoom format, so we can really have discussion after the presentation. So a bit of housekeeping. If you go to the top right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, you can select on speaker view, which would be great. And then as our speakers are giving their presentation, whoever speaks comes up in your screen. Please do mute yourself. I will be muting as people are, if they haven't muted themselves either. And let's see, I just wanted to say that past discussions are available on our YouTube channel. Today's will be added shortly after. And let's see, and then now we will get into our program. As we imagine the rebuild of our places and spaces to be safe, healthy, and equitable for all, I'd like us to pause in remembrance and pay respect to the tribes of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and the Micmac peoples. With respect for the tradition of these Indigenous people, we affirm their inherent sovereignty in this territory, and we are hopeful for healing. And with this, we will commit to the ongoing work of decolonization. Continuing our conversation on place and space, today we are hosting a conversation that will be facilitated by Libby Bischof, Dr. Libby Bischof, with the Osher Map Library and the Smith Center for Cartographic Education at USM. We are welcoming Steve Bromage, the Executive Director of the Maine Historical Society, Abraham Schechter, the Special Collections Librarian and Archivist at Portland Public Library, and Julie Larry, Advocacy Director for Greater Portland Landmarks. These individuals in our city are really the stewards of the history of our built space, and we're exceptionally lucky to really have this conversation about development that isn't actually attached to any major issue right now that's being discussed. It's almost all too often when we talk about our built environment in this town, it is a divisive controversy. So here we are able to talk about place and development, innovation and investment, you know, really from a historic lens, but also opening up conversation about what we all want to see going forward. This comes really weeks after the largest building has been approved, the highest building has been approved in the city of Portland. Portland is developing, you know, at a rate that some are critical of and some are excited by. And so I think just taking a step back and looking at where our history came from, the optimism, the visionaries, and or lack of, it will be a really rich presentation that I'm very much looking forward to the discussion after. So Libby will, Abraham will actually give a really brilliant slideshow. And then Libby will facilitate a series of questions that were prepared in advance, but it will be a bit more organic than that. And without further ado, I would also thank you, Jeanette, actually, for advancing this next slide. We have to thank our sponsors, and without their support, our underwriter, our benefactors, our sponsors, and our community partners. We can go to the next slide too. We are exceptionally grateful for the support for being able to provide free programs to create these conversations and points of inquiry. So thank you very much. We can now, again, I just want to remind everyone, if you can mute yourself, that would be fabulous. And we have Steve, Libby, Abraham, and Julie. Hi, everyone. And then Abraham's just going to share his screen and give a presentation. And I will unmute you, or I've asked to unmute you, and there you are. And I will mute myself. Thank you so much. Are you all set?
Yes. Libby, was there anything you wanted to say first?
No, Abraham, please
Okay.
go ahead and share your part and I'll jump right in. Thank you, though.
Very good. All right. You don't want to look at me, you look at the images. Here we are. Well, good afternoon. I put some images together for you. They are from the collections at Portland Public Library in the archives, and I added a couple of my own. Just to give a little context, because we'll start to look at Monument Square, oh my goodness, the Zoom display is preventing me from seeing the, oh, here we go. Now I can see it. Now I can see it. There we are. So it fills the screen. Very, very briefly, a little bit of context, because we can think, and I know we're looking at the 19th century here when Monument Square was called Market Square. And this is an image from the 1880s. And that is this building that you see was replaced by City Hall. But that aside, think perhaps when we look at the 20th century, especially the latter half in which we do get into one city center and Monument Square as we know it today, as an example among many throughout North America, at the very least, with parallel concerns in the post-war having to do with transitions of urban and suburban spaces and housing and commerce, and Monument Square is directly affected by this, highways, expressways, streets, and also vehicular traffic and how it gradually separates from pedestrian traffic and the growth of a lot of commerce outside of downtowns. But we'll get into the images and so that we can maximize the time that we have together. As I mentioned, this is the old Market Square. And when you look to the right, you will see that what we nicknamed the Golden Triangle, that's how it was known when all of this was demolished and replaced by one city center. The left-hand side is Congress Street, and behind that market, that the old City Hall is that US Hotel, which is now One Monument Square. It was replaced by that. And this is 1891, and you recognize the Soldiers and Sailors Monument when that was set into place. And in the background, you have the top of Middle Street. The square, and you see that it was a rotary, and in the background you have Middle Street. The left is that US Hotel, and you might remember it, or at least have seen it as, I'm going to just go back for a moment, as Edwards and Walker, and that was torn down in the mid 60s. It was 65, it was torn down. Here is our vicinity. And if you're able to see my cursor, I'm circling where this golden triangle is. There's a good view of it. It is the block that is flanked by Middle Street. Middle Street made a bend and it reached up to Congress Street. You can see also that the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial was a rotary. There were trolleys also that went around it at the time. But you have Middle Street, Federal Street, and Temple Street. And there's some things that you can recognize that are still with us, such as the bank buildings, and a little bit, they got a little bit taller in the mid 60s, and then the First Parish Church. But the Monument Square, suffice it to say, there is something missing here, and it's that Hammond block. And we start to see some of the puzzle pieces start to go away, and then they get replaced. But this golden triangle is where one city center is today. There's Edwards and Walker as it looked in 1941. And as I mentioned, it was demolished in 65. And you have the Asa Clapp block all the way on the left, Federal Street all the way on the right. Again, Monument Square, and you have another view of that triangle. a triangular shaped block. The city, as you can see, was really quite dense, but in this image is from, I would say this is circa 1960 because Edwards and Walker is still there, but you see some of the parts are missing. And the density is less even now than it was then. You have the old Burroughs Company, a little bit of it left on this lower left corner. And by 1966, Edwards and Walker is gone, right here at the head of the square. And there's the golden triangle, and some of the pieces are being eliminated just bit by bit. Temple Street was a very straight street, and it was rerouted to merge with Union Street as we see it today. The memorial, the square, is still this rotary. Now we see the Casco Bank building. This is a real photograph of transition. This is 1969, and you'll see Franklin Towers has been built. It's up here. The Franklin Arterial is just behind it. And then you've got the housing developments also of the time. An interesting thing to note is in 1969, a lot of things were going on in Portland, one of which was just outside the city, the mall was being built. And the mall's construction was between 69 and 71. That had a direct effect on downtown Portland. But I'm going to just try to keep the focus on the square. You can see the rotary is still there, and the triangle is losing its parts. Middle Street is still intact, but those buildings are being leveled with an urban plan in mind to change this. Here's another transition. In 1973, and this is part of the grand scheme of the Mainway project, which was really between Middle Street and Congress Square, just changing things. And you see that the rotary is being changed into a pedestrian mall. And you can still see traffic, vehicular traffic on Middle Street, which is behind the statue. There's a lot of transition in this image, and that's why I wanted to share that with you. You can see in the background on the left is Bosworth Hall. It was still there in 73, way in the background on the left. Meanwhile, while all of this paving and reshaping is going on at Monument Square, a short distance away is Canal Bank Plaza, and you're looking down Temple Street as it's being rerouted and flowing into Union Street. Canal Plaza was built in 71 and 72. And then the lower photo is from 1990. And you can see that one city center is standing, and it's a kind of a corridor. The lower left has Canal Plaza, and there's also one Portland Square that was built in 86. Now we go back again to the aftermath of the demolition of the Golden Triangle area, and also the contiguous area at the corner of Federal Street and Temple Street. This was the view in April of 74. And there's some things still to recognize, like the lower Hayes and the bottom of Free Street. And then there is certainly Canal Plaza. I always connect the development of that area, the demolition of the Falmouth Hotel, and the creation of Canal Bank Plaza, and then this area of Spring Street, connected to what was going on just to the right of this image, the Monument Square area. Another view looking up towards the square from Middle Street. And here's the parking garage just on the right. And that was extended later. It was built in 76, 77 and extended in 83. And we know the Nickelodeon is there today. But you have another view of the cleared away triangle. Here's a panorama. I did this when I was 19. I was a Portland School of Art student, and I made this because I was living in the Met building and I was watching one city center being built. And again, as I mentioned to Addie earlier, way on the left, you know, there it is, looming is Canal Plaza. This is 84. This is the spring of 84. Here's an aerial taken in March of 85. And you can really see that Temple Street garage is in two pieces, and the rerouting of Temple Street. But for our theme, you've got one city center being built in that triangular shaped block. And you have also two Monument Square, which was built in '79, kind of behind, I guess, or just immediately east of, today we call it One Monument Square. A lot of my patrons still call it Casco Bank. And there's the building in December of '85. You can see that it is, the exterior is still being worked on, but essentially the building is built, and a view towards Middle Street on the right-hand side. This is December of '85. And a view of the building in March of '97. At the time, it was Fleet Bank's headquarters. And then I took this. This is an interior. I have spent years with my lunch hour every day in this atrium at One City Center. So I guess you could call me an inhabitant to some extent. But this is the view looking up from the atrium and near these fountains. And here I discovered a Rembrandt moment right there in the atrium, and I thought you would like that too. See, one can be the philosopher right in that atrium. And lastly, we have a general view looking, imagine if you're up in the plain and you've got the waterfront behind you, and Canal Plaza in the foreground, One Portland Square at the left, One City Center right in the middle. And then you have the three bank buildings scaling from the center to the left. And that is what I put together for you. With respect to the time that we have, I can do this now.
Thank you,
And
Abraham, so much.
You're very welcome. And I'm happy to share this link too, if anyone is interested in seeing the images.
If you put it in the chat, I'm sure people would want to go into that.
Will do. Yeah. Especially
Thank
to
you
see
so
Rembrandt.
much for situating us in this place, in this space, in the city of Portland that we're talking about today. I put a series of links in the chat. I think what we bring to this conversation, the four of us who are a part of it, is really, in many ways, the four of us are stewards of collections and materials and items and objects and maps and memory of spaces in the land we now call Maine and in the city we now call Portland. And I think as we look to the future and we move forward and we reimagine a city, as every generation does, this is not new work, new for us, maybe different considerations, but this happens generationally, as we all know, is that in making and creating a new built environment, it's really important to be able to see the built environment and the ways in which it's changed over time. And so I shared a lot of links to our respective collections and organizations, because we're all people who would help you to do that in some sense. As you can see, the way in which Abraham is taken items from his collection, both where he works at the Portland Public Library and the Portland Room, but also his own personal collection and memories, and situated us in that space. So I would, in that sense, Steve, if I could ask you to talk a little bit about the ways in which Maine Historical, located on Congress Street, and your building footprint and your own kind of role in stewarding development there and thinking about the city, to talk a little bit about some of the things you have and some of the ways that you see this space changing over time.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Libby, and welcome. It's nice to see everybody today. Well, I think, we're in such a vibrant, dynamic time in Portland with so much enthusiasm, optimism, and so much just going on around the city and so much sense of potential. I think, one way I think about this is, we're constantly thinking about our campus and where it's situated in the city. And, for most of we have, among other things, the Longfellow House, built in 1785, our research library, which was built in 1907, and the Longfellow Garden around it. And we also have that lovely, beautiful, modern looking building where our gallery is, which actually the bones of that building was built in the 1820s. And it was lovely, lovely, lovely until probably the 1950s or so, when facades started being added and altered. Anyway, that building, as Nanuel knows, has been yankeed to death and has really gotten a lot of life out of it. So one of the things as we think about our work is just the opportunities for us as an institution, but really for that part of the city, you know, what comes next. I think we've seen so much development in Portland in the last couple of years, so much concentrated down on the waterfront and Commercial Street. And, you know, you really look at Congress Street and Monument Square and the area we're talking about as at Maine's Main Street in a lot of ways. And there's so many dimensions to Congress Street, from being the city's cultural corridor, from connecting the city from end to end. You look at the beautiful Art Deco buildings like the Time and Temperature, which really, really are gems. So, you know, I think this conversation is interesting because I think you know, the time has come for Congress Street to really have similar attention paid to it and investment made, and to be another kind of nexus of vitality and energy in the city. So we think about that in a lot of different ways. You know, the development of our campus, you know, we continue to look at how we can be a gateway and a jumping off point and an orientation point for all things Maine, which is really what our mission is about, and how our physical campus can contribute to it. So, you know, we're excited to see the bold efforts being made and attempted to kind of bring the Time and Temperature building back to life. You know, we're looking at our campus. So I think we're really excited kind of where Portland is, and hope to help be a catalyst in some way, shape, or form. Libby, to your point about collections, you know, our collections, you know, like the Portland rooms, document so many elements of Portland's development, going back from earliest photographs of Maine in the 1840s and 50s, documenting to the Portland Public Library has a tremendous archive of records from the Portland Press Herald. We have a similar archive of an earlier period. So there's just tremendous resources here. And then, you know, everything from community newsletters that talk about the developments of, you know, when Franklin Arterial was being put in. So there's lots of different ways of capturing it. In a minute, I'll share a couple of links just from Maine memory. We talked about, we have some wonderful color film from 1939-40 of the city. And I'll put in there a link to some aerial views of the city at that time, and also them pulling the trolley tracks out of Congress Street. So that's just started. So I'll stop for now and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And Julie, I'm wondering if I could invite you into the conversation as an architect who really is now an advocate for the built environment and preservation and growth, and what that really means, and to get a sense of how you envision this part of Portland growing up here and being in it so personally, but also professionally, if you could lead us in that direction.
Well, I think, you know, that COVID has really changed a lot, and we don't really know exactly where we're going forward. But I think one of the things that, looking back over a period of time, that I see constantly happening at Monument Square is buildings that are interacting with the urban environment. And so Steve was just talking about the Time and Temperature building, which had this amazing arcade on the interior, which I'll try and just share some photos of that while I'm talking about it. And so you have a building like that from the turn of the 20th century that you know, people could go into, they could shop, you know, there were offices upstairs, and then similarly again in the 80s, as we saw from the slides that Abraham shared with us, we have spaces that you know, that building also does the same kind of invitation into using the building in a public way. The City Hall building that was there historically was also a market space that you could go into. So I think that that Monument Square and the buildings around it will continue to be a strong strongly attractive space for the general public to interact in whatever capacity and density that we can have post-pandemic. You know, I think of some of the Live at 5 concerts that would happen in the square with the stage up on One City Center. So I think that that's going to continue. But I think that, you know, how interactive the public can be post-pandemic will be interesting. Is it more exterior usage and less invitation to come into what is seen as a more private space that's, you know, it's an office building where they're trying to limit the interaction of the public? I think those are all interesting things that we'll be considering as we're designing, or those of us who continue to design buildings post-pandemic.
Thank you. I'd like to ask my fellow panelists if anybody wants to respond to what Julie just said before we go in a different direction. I do in many ways think this, you know, that point you just made, Julie, about the ways in which the pandemic is changing the way not only we interact with one another in space and distance, but also the ways in which we interact in public spaces, both indoor and outdoor. And I think that that's a significant consideration as we move to the other side of this pandemic, in thinking about, you know, this amazing rediscovery for many people in Maine and beyond of the natural world around them. I can't tell you how many times I have driven by the Four River Sanctuary in my 15 years here and never stopped because I went for walks elsewhere, but it became my literal sanctuary to do walking Zoom meetings in March, April, and May. And so I'm thinking about if there is a new light onto this Monument Square One City Center area, because if you notice its public way of being, it's a place for holiday celebration. It's a farmer's market. It's a place of commerce and finance. It's a place where people eat. But I'm also, it's a place where people express their views in the true sense of that city square, market square mentality. There are vigils there. There are protests there. There are public conversations there. And I wonder if we can think about ways in which the built environment around it can support that voice, right? Like how does the public voice come into play, and the way in which people walk around and use a space come into play with the built environment around it? And I think that point about our office building is going to be even more closed to the public because of the pandemic and wanting to contact trace and know who's in there. We have seemingly this moment to innovate upon, and I'm just wondering what folks think about that, or if that sparks anything for anybody. Go ahead, Abraham, and then Steve.
Okay. An example to look at, excuse me, though so many things are on hiatus because of the pandemic, is the example of Congress Square Park. It's just a few blocks up from Monument Square. And it was nearly lost to us. And I think that the pendulum swing was so forceful to rescue the park that a friends group was generated out of that effort. And that interaction that you're referring to, Libby, is yeah, there's that architectural interaction, and I think that is still as yet I think it's still pretty fluid, but it's the community's interaction is very interesting because there are a couple of neighborhoods that are contiguous to Congress Square Park, and it turned out to be probably the busiest city park in the last couple of years with events, and they do all this gardening. There's actually just enough space to do some of this, and neighbors have really taken it upon themselves to keep the place clean and to hold events, even though the park is probably going to be improved upon, as well as we're hearing about the intersection even just in the last couple of days. But I think it's a really nice example of residents, and we'll see what happens with businesses and et cetera, and the streets getting very interested in a public square and making it a place of community and of interaction, and just the things that you were talking about, Libby. I think it's a great example to look at for Portland.
Thank you. Steve, how about you?
Yeah, just two quick thoughts. One is about the pandemic itself, and it'll be really interesting to see what its legacies are and how much we live with it permanently versus how much we compartmentalize and move on. I think you see, historically, you have challenging moments, and we know that this is going to shape our generations profoundly, and we're going to carry memories like the Depression, like the Spanish flu. But I also think we have a tendency to compartmentalize, and if people are vaccinated and they're not getting sick as much, and it's less of a presence in our lives, it'll be interesting to see the permanent impacts and how that affects things like uses of buildings and traffic in buildings. There'll be a new normal of some sort, in terms of probably work patterns and how people work. But, I could see the American population getting over its immediate phobia very quickly, because I just think that's the way brains tend to work, for better or for worse. Second point, I found it interesting, your point about just the interaction of the built environment and outdoor spaces. When we had our prep call, Abraham made an interesting point about the nature of Portland, the city, and perceptions, is Portland really a small city, or is it a big town? And for years, until the recent, the recent growth bubble, you hear all kinds of Mainers talk about the hassles of going to Portland because it's the city and parking and crime and all of these things, which if you've been in New York, it's amusing. So, I think part of this conversation, is acknowledging that, but I think this is also, again, visioning the future in the next section. And really, what is the most vibrant, wonderful Portland we can imagine going forward? What's driving the economy? What does it look like? How do people interact? But Libby, your point, one of the assets that we have is this natural world surrounding and intersecting all parts of the built environment. So you're up and you're looking out at the bay, you're looking at, the Eastern Promenade, you're looking at you have all these outdoor views that are kind of a complement and balance and work in relationship to the buildings. So maybe that's one of the real distinguishers and one of the things we build on, the interaction of the indoor and outdoor, as Portland figures out how to be, continues to figure out how to be, the most amazing small coastal city we can be.
Yeah, I agree, Steve. And I just want to throw this in. I like saying small town city because this is a place in which, well, again, when things are a little more normal, or let's say before March of last year, don't you always bump into people you know? Isn't it impossible not to bump into people you know? You can't do that in New York. But small town city, I think, is a niche that's worth owning, in the sense that, we do have neighborhoods in Portland, but there are neighborhoods in other cities that are actually the size of Portland. And that sense of familiarity, and I think it plays itself out in our public squares, and places like the public library and things in which the public is moving through and congregating.
And I think thinking about who lives in a city over time and who a city spaces really belong to. I mean, that public nature of it. One thing that I would encourage folks who are listening, who are interested in the changes in Portland over time and studying a history of immigration and land use and how neighborhoods build and develop and change, so much of Portland today and what people are being priced out of it, first-time home buyers, first-generation folks moving here. It's a city that's increasingly harder to find your space in, right? Like, where is that belonging and that community? And as an educator, I'm a professor of history long before I became an executive director, and I teach history of Maine, I teach history of Portland, and my students often work on projects like this. And last time I taught history of Portland, about a year and a half ago, I had a student of Armenian descent do this really amazing project with the City of Portland directories, where he literally could track how members of this community, families, would pool together and buy buildings and literally built enclaves within enclaves of collective belonging. And I just wanted to point people to resources like city reports, the city directories, to look at this growth and change, to think about how the sewer system has changed and developed in Portland as we, talk about these big buildings and these big projects, but that for Portland, infrastructure has been equally important to making access possible, and to look at neighborhood schools and things like that, which Portland has retained, and what that really means. So I think that growing and developing in that way, and thinking about who's been in the space and why and how, and why people live where they do. I mean, there's a reason why you get the area around the Abyssinian Church, the Abyssinian Meeting House, right, is a Black neighborhood in Portland in the 19th century, because you can walk to work on the docks. You are in that part of the city where it's convenient. So I think when we're thinking of the intersection of work and life, right now it's like our dining room table or our bedroom, or wherever we're Zooming. But this notion that people would live close to where they worked and be able to walk there. And I think there's a desire for some of that to come back.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Julie,
I think you're right. And one of the questions that Addie had asked us earlier was about kind of the off-peninsula neighborhoods too. And I think that this notion of looking back at how Portland developed, not just on the peninsula, but off peninsula, that you had neighborhoods that were more supportive of your day-to-day needs, and there wasn't the need to necessarily come downtown. And that was even done on very micro levels in the downtown. I look at Munjoy Hill there, every corner, it seems like, had a corner store where you could get your milk or eggs or whatever you needed. You didn't have to get in your car and drive to Hannaford's or get on the bus or the streetcar. And I think that when we think about looking forward to rezoning and the recode that will come up the city of Portland, and how to create or enhance those neighborhood centers so that we're not as reliant on the car going forward, and we're not as reliant on the peninsula to be the repository for everything, whether it's social services, transportation, parking, shopping, and how to strengthen our neighborhoods, and not just in Portland, in the suburbs as well.
Julie, to that end, I'm wondering if we could kind of move to this 1980s moment, right? That One City Center is such a growth and development of part of, and if you could, and then Abraham and Steve too, kind of bring us into that moment of like 1980s Portland development, and what is Portland trying to do in the 1980s?
Yeah, so I was still pretty young, but I mean, for me, I remember we were still coming in town to go shopping at Benoit's to Porteous. And I think the thing that struck me then was kind of like being in the desert. I mean, at the time, the parking garage wasn't built on Temple Street yet. We would park down at the Golden Triangle and walk up the hill to Benoit's, and it would be hot in August going back to school shopping, and it just felt like a wasteland. And I think that when I think about my career as an architect, that probably has some impact on me, and understanding that I don't like to see something torn down until it's replaced. I mean, I think of the parking lot between Center and Cross that goes from Spring Street to the waterfront has been empty almost my entire life. And, I'm 50 years old now. And so I think that has had an impact, but also there were some kind of bright shining moments of aspirational construction that was supposed to be happening. And I confided, and I'll share with everybody else, that in part also inspired me to want to become an architect. I mean, that was something that was going on. There was a lot of conversation in the papers and in just talk around town, and to dream and to be part of that was, I think, also part of it. And there was a lot of developers and controversy around developments at the time.
Please, Abraham.
When we were getting ready for this discussion, I had put together some salient years of things being built in the vicinity of the time of One City Center, and it's interesting to think about construction and intent. And I made a reference to 1969, and you saw in just one photo of all that was going on and near and around Monument Square. And also I mentioned South Portland, just this sprawl that was going on. But suffice it to say, in 80, the 4th Street parking garage was built. In between 81 and 83, the Museum of Art had its big expansion. At the same time, there was a major expansion at the mall. At the same time, One City Center was built, and at the same time, Chandler's Wharf was developed. So we were kicking this around, and also a lot of garages being built, like Monument Way, the Casco Bay Ferry terminal, that terminal that we know today with the garage. And when I talk about intent, and you look at, for example, One City Center, and I threw the photo of me using it and how many people use it as a place to congregate, that atrium that invites the public in. That is part of the intent of that. You know, there's seating, there are concessions. It is a place with a lot of portals, a lot of way to get into the place. And it seemed to me that probably the last building like this with this vision of bringing in the public is the Public Market building that's at the corner of Preble and Cumberland Avenues. That was finished in 1998. And there is a garage, you know, that goes with that. But it's just, you know, jogging my memory, I don't think there has been another building like this with an intent to bring in the public like this, of all of this congregating and mingling and commerce and leisure. It looks like since 1998, it's really been the resort economy, you know, whether it's the hotels or the upscale housing, Ocean Gate, you know, things that have to do with the city as a resort destination. And I think Libby makes a great point when it comes to the daunting prospect of housing within the city.
And you wanna, you know, I gotta ask that question, right, as we're talking about this and as we get ready to open it up to some questions in the chat and people joining the conversation, you know, on the call with us as well. What if the public doesn't want to come in anymore? I mean, that's what I hear so often about the city, and you know, even where I am in the city over at USM, and we're completely re-envisioning our campus. The ground is literally about to break on a huge new dorm and career and student center, which will transform this part of the city in many ways. But like, I'm thinking of these One City Center buildings, and if it's meant to come in and to congregate, what if now people are like trying to leave buildings and congregate outside again? What does that mean for space? So, you know, to the last question to the panel and kind of looking outward, how, you know, where do you all see Portland developing, and who gets to steward and to curate that vision, and how do we bring disparate voices, diverse voices into the shaping of our city? Solve all those problems in 2 minutes.
Yeah, I wish I had the answer.
Yeah. Well, I think, Libby, to me, you know, so many elements of these conversations, it's about where we put our eyes on the horizon and how narrow and specific we are to a specific project versus the overall trajectory of the city. And I think, you know, somewhere in the middle is where we need to have our kind of view. So to me, if you step back and put it in the context of what is going to make Portland the most wonderful, vibrant city 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, what are all the things that go into that? And I think it needs to be a very holistic approach. And so I think it starts with the economy, and what are the opportunities that Portland has to have a really strong economy that we can all feel secure in, that provides jobs and opportunity and a sense of security for people. I think that's part of the problem is, you know, the economy is so fractured and people don't know how it all fits together. So I think we need jobs to drive tax dollars, to drive individual opportunity, and just a sense of investment and buy-in, and we're part of a secure community. I think that's part of it. And so I think then, you know, how do you make sure so how do you identify and encourage and support the right kind of economic activities, whether that's resort stuff, whether that's big corporations coming downtown and having modern way of life. Because I think you really, we look at all the issues and things like street issues and Bayside and housing and affordable housing and what kind of shelters we need. All of these things end up talking about in isolation. And even as I look in our neighborhood and issues we have, just in our immediate environment around our offices, we need to look at all of these things together. And we're going to be better equipped to figure out affordable housing, shelter issues in the context of an overall vision that has a vibrant economy and a sense of that all of it is part of Portland's well-being. I don't know if that helps.
And that people can see themselves in it.
That's right. That's right.
For
So
sure.
I know a lot of people on this call from the architecture community and the landmarks community are very kind of involved in process and think a lot of that, I'm a step out of there, but I think we've got to look in the big picture, how it all fits together. And it's not one building versus another building, but it's how do all these things fit together. And we also need a diversity. As a history guy, I embrace the new, and I think we need the new opportunities and the new buildings that are going to become the landmarks of the future. So it's not all just holding on to, but it's how we put all the pieces together.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Abraham. I think we'll bring others into the conversation now too. Addie, this is you. I think coming in and moderating it, and we can take some comments too. I see David, you're raising your hand. Please go ahead and unmute and share.
Oh, you're muted, my friend. Can you unmute?
There we go.
There he is.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Douglas. I'm an architect and I'm the owner of Envelope Architecture and Consulting. We happen to be working on Time and Temp, so that's a very exciting project. I heard you guys mention that earlier. The one thing that I want to add, and it comes up a lot, but it's often ignored, and it's certainly ignored by the city of Portland. The peninsula grows every day. It more than doubles, at least it used to before COVID. It more than doubles in population every day because of commuter traffic, people coming to work, people coming and being part of the city. The fact that we are ignoring this elephant in the room, we have to accommodate cars. We have to have more traffic flow. We have to do a better job of accepting the fact that cars aren't going away and we have to get people in and out of the city. It shouldn't take a half hour to get from Casco Bay Bridge to Riverside Street. It should take 10 minutes. So I just want to mention in all of this, and I think it's just as important of everything else we've talked about, that transportation, personal transportation in Maine, it's not going to change. We're not going to have light rail. We're not going to have trams again. We have to accept this, and we have to build it into our future and quit ignoring it. So thank you.
David, I think that's such an excellent point. And you can't do this planning without thinking of transportation infrastructure. And that's what the 19th and 20th century planners were perhaps even more well aware of than we are today. I think we could argue today that it was short-sighted to get rid of a lot of the rail that we did, especially with the rail coming back on the waterfront and a growing port again, in terms of tonnage and global. But people forget that, yeah, we have AIMSKIP and this incredible connection in the building up of the Port of Portland. But in the 1920s, ships were coming into Portland from all over the world. So this nature of thinking about transportation, I think you're dead on. And there's ways to think about sustainable and public, but cars do not appear to be going on, and any growth model in the city needs to take that into account.
This is such a hot topic, and it's interesting because, again, GPCOG just put out their transit for tomorrow, but as Abraham had said earlier, Portland is a small town city, and Maine does not have a statewide or even region-wide robust transit system. I think when we say transportation, we think car or rail, which is interesting because there are buses. There is, putting the rubber to the wheels. There's a huge potential for increasing that. and really getting people to shift their mind around that single occupancy vehicle. But it's also a comfort level too, and it's a lifestyle. So I think that, you know, and I know that there are many opinions around this, but the built environment is 100% shaped by that need. 2 years ago, we did, yes, there's, as Kevin types in, multimodal. 2 years ago, PSA did a series of summer construction tours in parking lots to specifically raise the awareness that more parking was being built on the peninsula than housing. And so just to also look at that, like, and are these parking lots being built to eventually be repurposed for something else, or are they just being built as sort of the warehouse of the car? Cars are not going away, but people are rethinking how they're using them. And I don't know whether the amnesia will increase again, that doubling of the city, or where the remote workers will go and what those opportunities are. And I think that that's where we all are. So we're sort of talking, what is the vision? And I think to Libby's last question, and this is really, I would love people to chime in, because I know all of you on this call, and I know you all have histories and opinions. But in really truly visioning for tomorrow, or today, really, like today, how do you get there? You know, and what are your visions? I will stop speaking, but I will manage. If people people talk as much as me, I'll make a comment.
I think one of the things as a native Mainer that we always struggle with is this kind of local rule versus working cooperatively across municipalities. And I think the JP-COG study, you know, starts talking about thinking regionally, but I think that's something we need to do better, particularly with regards to transportation and how decisions that Portland makes have land use impacts on other communities, and how the land use decisions that other suburban communities make have an impact on the city of Portland as well. And we need to think more holistically and work together more, I think.
If I may, I want to add that I know that before a year ago, because we tend to think that way because of this hiatus that we're surviving. It looked to me as a 36-year West Ender that the unaffordability of Portland has created really other small town cities like Westbrook, Biddeford, places like Topsom. It seems that sprawl at, you know, when you see these photos of the thinning out of the square and all that demolition, it was the growth of suburbs. You could have your own private house with a driveway and a backyard. I think it's really more an economic motivation. And so the cars are coming into the city owned by residents that are coming in from farther and farther away places due to that. And it might happen that there will be micro economies or smaller economies, not micro, but smaller, that are growing in the smaller towns that are, they are drawing expat Portlanders, and they may become more freestanding.
George, go ahead.
Thank you. George Rowe, I live in West Bayside, and I've definitely been, the last 5.5 years, been sort of in the middle of a lot of these conversations, but I just wanted to point back to our subject matter, our city center building. And I think it visually, you know, two sides of that triangle are extremely anti-pedestrian and anti-people. And I think that is just puts a point on what so many people have said today, which is we want to move forward in Portland with our 19th century human scale. But the realities of the present, really the automobile and, you know, things like building manacles and, you know, whatever other reasons the Golden Triangle building got designed the way it did, you know, one side of it is very friendly. One side tries to inspire us to think back to a different kind of city, but then the other two sides basically are the exact opposite and are cold and forbidding and turn their back on the city. And I think that, you know, and I'm making a plug for Libby here and Steve and Abraham and Julie, we need to know our history. And this town forgets more history in a day than it remembers in a year, because it refuses to, you know, Libby talked about the Armenian families buying up buildings before there were, you know, government mortgages. In 1926, the first thing that the new city manager form of government did was to implement a draconian new zoning code that basically made it almost impossible for immigrants to own property in a lot of our urban neighborhoods, because their ability to fund those buildings was through a mixed use form of family financing. And we banned mixed use buildings in most of the peninsula. And so they could no longer run a little store on the first floor. So they could no longer get rent from a storekeeper to help pay the bank. And that was devastating to a lot of the urban neighborhoods that we sort of talk about today in kind of glory, you know, sort of, you know, very glorifying ways, but we forget that we killed those neighborhoods intentionally, both with the automobile and with zoning and with other things. So I just think, and again, what I also, my last point is the building in the 80s, another example
I don't know.
of
George, you're breaking up.
George, we're losing you.
We're losing you, George.
Cycle, which is true. Oh,
There he is.
okay, sorry. That's the reason I don't have my video on.
No worries.
Our house has had terrible internet service the last couple of days. So,
Will you type the 80s
so
comment
anyway,
into
I'm
the
just
chat?
wrapping up just to say that yep, yeah. I'll do that. So thank you so much.
Type it in, it would be great, like Libby said. So
Yeah, I
we
would
can-
really, because I really
Yeah,
want to hear
yeah.
that 80s comment. I think you make such an excellent point though. And I think that's part of, you know, when Addie reached out to talk to me about envisioning and putting together this panel. I think that this city ignores its history at its peril,
Absolutely.
you know, in development time and time again. And it's not unique in that way. It's just that it's ironic because the city, the history is so accessible. It is literally there. It is digitized. It is ready. It is, you can even during the pandemic, you can access it. And so, you know, in teaching with these collections as we do, and the advocacy and education work that Greater Portland Landmarks does as well, we really are inviting younger generations to understand their city, both past, present, and future. And I think with that context and that grounding, you get these really incredible ideas, because it's also a new generation of people looking for their own place within this environment and not finding it. And I think, and being very surprised when they find themselves in the past, but not in the present.
Mhm.
And I think that that's where Portland really has to do some looking. And George, I appreciate the point. We're very much a 19th century city, but we're also a 17th century city and an 18th century city. And that's layered into the landmarks. And that 21st century city was literally plopped on top of that, and not always thoughtfully. So how can the 21st century city moving forward be more thoughtful about the different layers and levels, and who was here first, and how the shoreline was used, and how this was an indigenous place? Like, where does that come into this? And I think that that's a direction to really look backward, to come forward, and to see how a city talks about its past as it imagines its future.
I just want to point out that it is 1 o'clock and I know that folks do have to leave. However, we can keep the conversation going. And for those that do have to leave at 1, just keep in mind that this will be recorded and available really by the end of today, but that this isn't the end of the conversation. And as Libby absolutely said, and George, thank you. We don't know our history, but we have these resources. You know, we have 4 stewards of the documentation of the history of building, and it's just extraordinary to know and to have these dialogues. I mean, when I invited Libby in and she said, why one city center? And I said, well, in a way it's so rich, but it's also so benign because right now there's no controversy around it. We can actually have free, open conversation without divisive sides. And I think that we need to have more of that to really understand the evolution and the build out of the city. So for those that do have to leave, thank you. But for our guests today, I think you can stay on for about 10, 15 minutes. I'm also borrowing somebody's space too, so I'm very cognizant of time.
You've got me for 5 before I have to teach. But I want to just say, how 80s is it to name something one city center, right? Like, look at me. I just think that's so interesting. Abraham, go ahead.
And the original name was One Mainway Plaza. Everybody wants to be one, always one. What about, 18 or something, or 13? We need more 13s. Go ahead, Steve, sorry.
Yeah, Libby, your comment about the Abyssinian and its location and walking to work triggers something I think is really important here. And that's, we talk a lot about vision and planning. There's also a functionality, how we live within our cities based on where we're working and where we're living. And to me, even the more dominant kind of example of that is Munjoy Hill and the Portland Company. So you had the Portland Company there, which was a driver of the city's economy, creating products sent all around the state and around the world that attracted immigrant communities that needed to live. And so, the makeup of Munjoy Hill and its rich ethnic neighborhoods, which are so much part of Portland's, 20th century history and late 19th century history, so shapes our character and our identity. So all the conversations about Munjoy Hill's development now, for example, I mean, there was such a functionality about proximity and being able to work. But again, it was driven by the fact that there were jobs, which created opportunities, which brought people here. And then there was a functionality that grew out of that. Interesting. So it's just interesting. I mean, again, all these issues are so interconnected.
Any more questions? A lot of folks have been putting stuff in the chat too. Thank you. Well, I will be respectful of time, so I'll give a few more seconds to anyone that wants to chime in.
Thanks, Addie, for having us and for putting it together.
Oh, I'm so grateful. There's actually, it's Jeanette Schramm and Gretchen Rabenkin, Stephanie Barak, and Lisa Whitehead. We really have been meeting weekly for the last year, talking about this, hosting smaller roundtables, talking with property managers, co-working space, HR folks, really thinking about how are you using downtown space, particularly in the corporate sector, but opening this dialogue up is really important, and it's just the start. So while I'm saying this concludes the COVID-19 1 year later month-long series, please look for more. We have amazing programming coming up in April that I am not ready to release yet, but it's going to be awesome. It's just still in the works. But each month we're going to be doing some kind of different programming. And we've also found that the success of Friday afternoons at noon works really well as well. So thank you everyone so much. Really, all 4 of you are incredible resources and great city assets. Would anyone else like to say anything as last words, or as I put you all on to see everyone?
There's some nice comments in the chat, so thank you, and thanks for taking time during lunch to really think about the past and the context of that. And the more people do that,
yeah,
the better we'll all be.
Absolutely.
But I'm a historian, so I have to say that.
Well, thank you. Well, once again, thank you, everyone, and more soon.
Thank you.